Sometimes when you get a glimpse at what's behind the curtain, it kind of sours to you to what's in front of the curtain, doesn't it? Like the two things that you really don't want to know how are made, right? Is the old joke, sausage and laws. When Dorothy got a look behind the curtain with the lion and the Tin Man and the Scarecrow, they were pretty let down, weren't they? And what does the life of a hero look like? Sometimes we're pleasantly surprised, but just how consistent it is. But other times we're let down, aren't we? In this next section of Philippians, we're going to get a look at the daily business of the life of Paul. And I ran into this picture this week, and I kind of liked it. So this is a reusable grocery list from the 1920s. Isn't that kind of cool? For those that can't read it, we've got butter, cake, cereal, cheese, cocoa, cookies, coffee, cream, delicacies, eggs, fish, flour, etc. It's surprisingly relatable, isn't it? Even from the 1920s. And it's a pretty cool little contraption, you flip it over and back. I mean, I use Apple reminders, but this would work just as well. And it's kind of neat, because here is something so dated, yet something so familiar. Something that still plays a part of our daily lives, doesn't it? The letters that Paul is writing to the churches that become our scriptures, they really are letters. The church recognizes them as scripture at the time. Even Peter calls Paul's letters scriptures. But at the same time, these letters they're really just letters from a real person, written on real parchment, sent to a real congregation, carried by real messengers. Nowadays, I think it's safe to say that perhaps most of the world's correspondence is done through the internet or through digital means. But rewind just a couple decades, and most of it's still handled on paper, right? Or by telephone or telegram. Rewind even further, and we're back to just paper. In Rome, at the time, it was similar, but still quite different. The Roman system of mail handling was pretty much only available to Roman officials and for official government business. And a good day's ride or carry was about 20 miles a day. If you weren't fortunate enough to be able to use the official system, which very, very few people were, you could hire a private carrier, but that was pretty cost prohibitive to the average person. So most people were either left sending somebody to take the letter with them on a journey, a trusted friend or family member, or they could risk it by giving it to a merchant and hoping that they would deliver it. That was uncertain and risky for both parties, because for the carrier, who knows if the merchant's actually going to deliver it or read it or do what with it. And for the merchant, it was risky because they didn't get paid for it until they delivered it. So, and then maybe they wouldn't get paid if they delivered it. Who knows? So what people would do, which is a very common sense thing to do, is you'd give out half a dozen or so letters to different merchants and hope that one of them got to where it was going to go. And if it was going any real distance, it took a while to get there. From Rome to Jerusalem is about 2,200 miles. From Washington State to Florida is closer to 3,000 miles. I can call my mom right now. I'd interrupt her at church, but I can call her and be on a FaceTime call in her in minutes. But to get a letter from Rome to Jerusalem, you got to walk it. And maybe 20 miles a day is a good haul. So it could take months. It could take a month or more to get to it. And Paul now is sitting in prison. He can't use the official system. This isn't government business. The private system is really far too expensive. So Paul has to rely on very practical method. of his companions taking his letters to the people he's sending it to, one of which goes to a colony called Philippi, some 400 or so miles away from Rome. And just before the turn of the century, the Romans changed the system to a relay system, from a relay system like we had in the Pony Express, to a single person carrying the letter from start to finish. See, that was a lot slower than the relay system, but it did have an advantage, a trade-off. It was safer, and it was a more secure delivery method. And the person carrying the letter would also be able to help answer questions that the reader might have of the author. The carrier was then treated with the same or similar respect that you would treat the one who sent him. So it was important that you pick a good representative, and it was important that you treated that representative well, because they're carrying news of you back to the sender. It reminds me of a proverb that we run into in Proverbs chapter 26, verse 6. It says, "Whoever sends a message by the hand of a fool cuts off his own feet and drinks violence." Miscommunications can lead to disaster, can't they? Marriage is just a microcosm of this. Simple miscommunications can lead to a lot of unnecessary heartache. And that is face-to-face conversations. Now add a mediary, someone in between you and the person you're trying to communicate with. You need someone who knows both your message and the heart with which you send it, because they're going to understand your tone in the message as they deliver it. Now, what if, as we sent our own text messages, whatever emoji we sent, one of those facial expressions that you attach, what if that got scrambled every time you sent one? That would be pretty doggone confusing, wouldn't it? I love you. I love you. Now, add some armies behind that. Add some political conflict in the background, and a slight offense raises the stakes even higher. And that proverb begins to make a whole lot more sense, doesn't it? Whoever sends a message by the hand of a fool cuts off his own feet and drinks violence. Because miscommunications are costly. In fact, they can be very costly. And if someone sends a message to you, or a messenger to you, and you mistreat them, and that messenger brings back a report to the person who sent the message, you're sending a direct message back to the person who sent the letter, just how you feel about them. Today's section in our text is a bit like getting a look at the practical day-to-day lives of the apostle and his contemporaries. It's kind of like looking behind the curtain into the human lives and the realities of these people. Let's read the whole section together, and then we'll go a little bit deeper. It begins in Philippians chapter 2, verses 19, and we're going to stop at 30 at the end of the chapter. Paul begins, "I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare, for they all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with the Father he has served with me in the gospel. I hope, therefore, to send him just as soon as I see how it goes with me. And I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will come also. I have thought it necessary to send you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need. For he has been longing for you and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. Indeed, he was ill, near to death, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I am the more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. So receive him in the Lord with all joy, and honor such men, for he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me." Does it feel like quite a bit of a shift in this letter? We went from theological mountain peaks to what kind of feels a bit like that mundane list of letter logistics. If you weren't here the last couple weeks, if you read back in the last chapter or two in Philippians, we've traveled through some of the richest and most dynamic sections of Paul's letters. One of the most powerful and rich descriptions of Christ's work was just a few verses before. Last week we saw a rich weaving of our salvation, both from guilt and our slavery to sin. And that looks like the opposite of what the Jews did in the wilderness when they were grumbling and complaining constantly. And Paul's rejoicing in his suffering and urging his readers also that as they face the swell of persecution coming and the division that's beginning to form within because of selfish ambitions and empty conceit. And then we shift to this. It feels a bit abrupt, a bit demystifying. Feels a bit ordinary, doesn't it? But I think that's beautiful. First off, this is a letter. And then second off, this is a letter, right? What a letter to write somebody with the heights of the theological mountain peaks that Paul brings. But it's practical and down to earth at the same time. Having looked at this text a little closer, I've come to appreciate it quite a bit. In it, we hear more about the things going on in Paul's lives, as well as a couple of his traveling companions. The first of which is Timothy. A quick look at this guy, Timothy. Timothy is a native of Lystra. He's a third-generation Christian. His mother, Eunice, and his grandmother, Lois, were both Christians. Somewhat of a testimony to the positive influence of faithful moms and grandmas. However, he came from a blended family. His mother was a Jew, but his father was a Greek. And if you know Jewish customs, Timothy could kind of get a pass with only one Jewish parent, but he was also uncircumcised. And if you understand the Old Covenant and Jewishness, that kind of meant you were a bit of a half-breed. And the guy had Jewish blood, but he still wouldn't quite cut it as a Jew, if you get my meaning. There's more to say on that, but probably next week. But in the church, Paul saw something in Timothy that was quite outstanding. It was his character. Timothy would be one of the constant traveling companions of Paul, and himself would later be a pastor in this church in Ephesus. And Paul would write him a couple letters. They show up later in our Bibles as 1st and 2nd Timothy. Timothy would also find himself in prison as well. But it's clear from everywhere that he's mentioned that he's really highly thought of. Let's read again what Paul says about him here. I hope in the Lord to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. In reality, Paul is going to send Epaphroditus to the Philippians first. So it's interesting here that Paul mentions Timothy first. And it's not because of chronology, but it's because of importance. Paul's most eager to hear a good report of the unity and faith of the Christians in Philippi. That the gospel is being magnified by the Christians, and that this would bring joy to Paul. Paul, being imprisoned, he's no longer free to move around, but instead he has to rely on the reports of other people. And there's no one else who he can send whose judgment he trusts more than Timothy. And I imagine this would feel a bit like a pop quiz to the church in Philippi, wouldn't it? It's kind of like when I asked my kids if their room is clean, and they said, yeah. And they say, mind if I come have a look? Well, hold on just a second. Give me a couple more minutes. So they run up and spend a few more minutes, and then I can come look. I bet Timothy's visit would have been a bit like a pop quiz for the Christians. They have some things they need to work out. There's selfish ambition, rivalry going on in this church that's threatening the unity and the church's testimony. Paul's going to send the letter back with Epaphroditus, but he's going to send Timothy afterwards to check in on him. And I think we can take Paul at face value here. He genuinely is expecting a positive outcome, a good report. And he's looking forward to it and the cheer that it will bring him, their faithfulness to Christ. And there's a sort of trust but verify sense about Paul here, huh? He's optimistic about a good report, but he'd still like the report. The guy is going to still send Timothy along. And he explains that I have no one like him who will genuinely be concerned for your welfare, for they seek after their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. And I think we can take Paul at face value here, too. He's genuinely expecting a positive outcome. And I love that this verse is tying together in a real sense what we've read just only a couple weeks ago. The ones who are putting Christ ahead of their own interest. And he's likely here referring to the ones who don't, as the ones we referenced earlier in the letter as well, the ones who are pursuing their own interests, that are wanting to cause Paul distress. He doesn't have anybody else in Rome that he can send like Timothy. And this is a little glimpse into a lived theology. Everything that Paul was urging the Philippians about before, here comes to flesh right in front of us. I love to see the quality that Paul highlights too. When you see people through God's eyes, you tend to see different things and focus on different things. What Paul values about Timothy, it's his servant heart. Now this likely assumes many things already. That his theology is somewhat good, that he's a confessing Christian. But the thing that distinguishes him more than anything else in this letter is that he genuinely seeks the welfare of other people, and most of all the interests of Jesus Christ. Such a simple yet powerful example of the theological mountaintops that we just read in the life and death of the Son of God. It's not some brave feat that you have to accomplish, not some diploma you have to achieve, or some kind of spiritual seniority. It's just simple, consistent, day-to-day attitude, one that Timothy displays well. But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with a father he has served with me in the gospel. Talk can be a lot easier than walking it out. Paul has had people they thought were up to the task before, but abandoned him mid-journey and put him in a difficult spot. More on that at another time, though. But Timothy has proven by experience that he's genuine, and that his talk lined up with his walk. His proven character has been seen by his service, both in Paul and to the Christians in Philippi, and they know it. Timothy is the kind of guy Paul would love to send as a messenger. Someone who will represent Paul's interests, who will deliver a message and a report in the spirit that Paul meant it, with the right values in place to understand it. I hope, therefore, to send him just as soon as I see how it will go with me. And I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will come also. Sometimes you and I, often actually, probably, use hope in the sense of not sure, it would be nice. Paul, though, and in the New Testament, this is more of a confident expectation, not a wishful thinking. That he's confident that his hope is therefore to send him, just as soon as he sees what it goes with him. He needs to see what's going to happen to him in prison. And then he can send Timothy as well. Paul wants to see if he's going to be able to get out soon. Timothy's his best help. And prison is not like we know it in the U.S. or in lots of parts of the world. Prison in Rome, it's not a place of punishment. It's a place of holding until punishment. So you didn't go to prison to sit there for years on end. You went there to prison to be held until your punishment was figured out. And they didn't provide anything for you. They would let you die in your cell if nobody brought you food. Prisons in Rome were brutal. They were terrible. It wasn't until later, when Christians gained more influence in Rome, that Christian charity really started to take care of people that were in prison much better. So prison is a harsh reality. And Paul needs the simple provisions, the simple grocery list. And Timothy's there to help him with that. And so in some sense, Paul's sending Timothy is a deep kindness as well to the Philippians. Because this is his best guy, and he's letting him go to visit Philippi. And just like earlier, Paul said, to live is Christ and to die is gain. No matter what happens, Paul wins. But he's still thinking of other people's interests more than his own. And he desires to still be of service to his brothers and sisters in their faith. In fact, he's willing to let his life be poured out as a drink offering upon their faith in service to the Lord. But you'll notice too that he says that he trusts in the Lord. This reminds me of James. Somewhere. Must have not gotten in the slides. I'll just read it. It's in James chapter 4, verses 13 through 15. In James it says, "Come now, you who say, today and tomorrow..." We'll get you back to the trust in the Lord. Yeah. "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we'll go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that." Paul knows that all of his plans depend on the approval and provision of the Lord. And it's good to make plans. And it's good to submit those plans to the Lord. And it's good to be willing to change them as the Lord wills. Paul now introduces the next guy, Epaphroditus. And you know, we only meet him one place in the New Testament, and that's here in Philippians. Verses 25 and 26. Let's see. Cole will help me find it. But in the meantime, I'll read it here. It says, "I have thought it necessary to send you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need. For he has been longing for you all, and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill." Paul is planning on sending both Timothy and Epaphroditus, which seems a bit odd. And he's sending Epaphroditus first, even though he's mentioning him second, like we mentioned before. And this is another little window into that grocery list of the first century. It's likely that Epaphroditus traveled with a couple companions to bring some provisions to Paul in prison, because he's got to get food from somewhere. And the Philippian church really cared about him and wanted to kind of send him a care package and help provide for him. And they send Epaphroditus to bring him with some companions. And walking around 15 to 20 miles a day would be kind of a good haul if they could do it. But during this journey, Epaphroditus, he got sick. Now, when you get sick back then, you didn't always have a great chance of getting better. And getting sick was a real problem. And news had probably carried back. So Epaphroditus gets real sick. And his companions, or a couple of his companions, probably made their way back to Philippi before knowing what happened with Epaphroditus. And so the church back at home, they would have known Epaphroditus got real sick, but they wouldn't have any way to hear what happened, what's going on with him. Because remember, somebody's got to carry that news physically all the way back. So they'd have no idea. And knowing someone you love is seriously ill and not knowing what is happening to them, it's a pretty hard place to be. And Paul says it here too, that indeed he was ill near to death, but God had mercy on him. And not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. He was sick. He was really sick. He was about to die sick. But God had mercy on him and he got better. We see Paul sees God's mercy and his kindness as a gift to him as well. Because if he died, he would have sorrow upon sorrow. Here, like in other places in our section today, we get a little glimpse of the day-to-day reality of a faithful Christian. Paul knew that if Epaphroditus would have died, he would have been in a better place, that for him to die was gain. He knew that he would see him again when he would be in heaven. He knew that God worked everything out for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. He knew every silver lining, and all of those things are true. Yet we see here that sorrow, that grief, sadness at the loss of someone you love, it's normal and even normalized for an apostle. All the things we said, they're true, and they are a comfort, and they can help lessen the grief and offer a road ahead, but sorrow has an authentic place in the life of a Christian. Joy doesn't necessarily mean the absence of sorrow. It's more the ability to rejoice in the middle of it. But Paul is eager here to send him. Therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. If he sends him home, the Philippians can relax and know that he's okay. He was really sick, but he's okay. Again, we see an apostle experiencing the normal day-to-day life struggles and the normal emotions that come with it. Paul's not some stoic monk removed from all care and worry, who has severed his emotions for the sake of truth. Instead, he walks through the normal tides of life just like us. He's confident in his hope in Jesus, and that gives him a heading. It points his compass, and it gives him the strength to endure each day in the trials. But he goes through them just like us. So receive him in the Lord with all joy and honor such men. For he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete that what was lacking in your service to me. Paul emphasizes here just how serious his sickness was. Remember, there was really no way of telling how bad it was. Perhaps the Philippians would not have believed that he was really that sick, because you don't really see it when they're all better. This can be true too for us when we know somebody who's dealing with chronic pain. We can't really see the degree of suffering they're wrestling with, and there's a tendency to downplay it because we can't see it. Paul wants them to know, no, this was serious. And you can't see it now, but he really almost died for Christ. And he should be honored. And at first reading, sometimes this last bit of the line looks like a bit of a diss to the Philippians, but it's really not meant that way. It's more of, he's provided what you were unable to do, or what wasn't possible, or your effort, but you couldn't make it work. He's filled that gap. He's helped further your desire for me to be taken care of. He's in that place. He's filled that space. The Christian life, when you layer the rich theology of Romans and the high Christology of Philippians and the rest of the riches of the truth of God into our normal daily lives, it looks a lot more reachable, a lot closer to home. Paul's dealing with how to get messages back and forth, how to help a church get past its issue of selfishness, and doing it while stuck in a prison. It looks remarkably ordinary. And I think that should be a great encouragement to us. Our Christian beliefs find expression in our daily lives, in the way we put others' interests ahead of our own because we love Jesus, and because Jesus loved us by doing exactly the same thing. And God has a message for people in our lives. And He's picked you and me to deliver it. There are people in my life that you'll never get a chance to have a voice in. People I know and talk to that you will likely never meet or have a relationship with. And there's people in your life that me or the other people here in this room will likely never get the chance to meet or talk to. And God has handed His letter to us to deliver to them. He wants us not just to deliver His message, but to represent Him in the way that we deliver it. And if we faithfully deliver the message and they reject it, it's really Him they're rejecting and not us. But we have to deliver it. Because much more than being rejected, worse is failing to deliver the message. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can be a simple conversation, a gentle suggestion, one given from a heart that really cares more about them than our feelings getting hurt, or our embarrassment at being rejected or ridiculed. I encourage you to be faithful in delivering the message God has given to you for the people in your life. He wants them to know just how much He loves them. And it's not all that complicated. It's living the values, the truths of Christ to each other, to those we know. The Philippians sent Paul a care package. They just wanted to take care of his physical needs. They loved him. Epaphroditus risked his well-being to deliver. He cared about them. Timothy served with a heart of service and love. And Paul was trying to figure out how to get letters back and forth. This is daily life, but we can do it in a way that honors God and reflects the character of Christ. And I hope that as we deliver our letters, that we do it in a way that the message reflects the messenger, reflects the giver of the message. Pray with me. God, we thank You for this glimpse into the daily life of an apostle, a kind of peek behind the curtain, a view that helps us to see that our lives, while removed by centuries, they share common concerns, challenges, anxieties, and sorrows. That simple acts of kindness with others' interests at heart can make an eternal difference. And it's not as difficult as we make it sometimes. God, help us to see the people in our lives who You would like us to deliver a letter to. Help us to have the courage just to open up the conversation, to risk a little for You and for their ultimate well-being. God, may You work through us and in them to share You and the joy and peace that come from You and Your Son and in the Holy Spirit. We pray these things upon the authority and approval of Your Son, Jesus. Amen.